Breaking news overnight, Republican South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham has died at 71 years old. His office writing, quote, on the evening of Saturday, July 11th, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham passed away from a brief and sudden illness. Senator Graham's family appreciates prayers this time and asks for privacy during this incredibly difficult period.
At this hour, no cause of death has been revealed, but police reportedly responded to a cardiac arrest call at his home and were seen carrying a person away on a stretcher to an awaiting ambulance. Senator Graham had just returned from Ukraine, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv as part of his efforts to end the war with Russia.
President Trump paying tribute to the longtime senator and his close ally. He posted, quote, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known, is dead. He was always working and was a true American patriot. Lindsey will be greatly missed. Details and arrangements to follow. So sad.
And reactions pouring in from around the world. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posting, quote, Israel has lost one of its greatest friends. America has lost a patriot. Senate Majority Leader John Thune says, quote, his influence on the federal judiciary, our national defense, and his beloved South Carolina will be felt for generations. And in his home state, fellow South Carolina Senator Tim Scott writes, Lindsey remained committed to public service and doing what he loved. He always introduced levity and brought wit to the most challenging moments. And Governor Henry McMaster remembers him as the fiercest of fighters for South Carolina and America, and a loyal and steadfast friend.
Lindsey Graham's fight for our country started long before he was elected to the Senate, serving 6.5 years as a U.S. Air Force military prosecutor and defense attorney. Upon leaving the Air Force, he joined the South Carolina Air National Guard, serving for another 6 years before joining the U.S. Air Force Reserves, where he performed numerous short-term reserve duties in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He retired at the rank of colonel after 33 years in uniform.
The senator came from humble beginnings, being raised in central South Carolina, where he lived in a single room with his family. Graham then became the first in his family to attend college, where he lost both his mother and his father within 2 years at the age of 20. But this didn't stop his drive for the American dream, taking on the responsibility of raising his 13-year-old sister, Darlene, who he later adopted, and running his family business, all while still in school. Senator Lindsey Graham was 71 years old.
For more on his life and legacy, let's bring in Chief Congressional Correspondent Chad Pergram. Good morning, Chad. It's sad news to wake up to, and I know you knew him well.
Yeah, I had just tried to talk to him a couple of weeks ago. The Senate has been out this past week, and I was trying to get him. I chased him out the Senate door, out to a car, and he was just in a hurry and didn't have time to talk at that point because Lindsey Graham was always on the move. As you indicate, he had just been to Ukraine. It was very typical to hear from his office, that he was going to be in the Middle East or he was going to be in Europe or someplace. And would we care to have an interview with him? I mean, he was always in the middle of almost every policy debate. And I think it was very striking that he had just been to Ukraine over the weekend here. He had celebrated his 71st birthday on Thursday and had met with Volodymyr Zelensky and trying to figure out a way to end this war. And this is what he had to say in Ukraine just a couple of days ago.
I've never been more optimistic than I am today that we have the formula to end this war. Help Ukraine be more lethal. Let those supporting Russia to know it's going to be a price to be paid if you keep doing it. And to try to find an off-ramp, not to humiliate Putin, but to end this war so that Ukraine will thrive and survive.
Now, here's what's interesting about Lindsey Graham. You know, he had been a House member, was elected to the House in the big Republican wave in 1995. He kind of moved onto the national stage. He was one of the House prosecutors presenting the case of impeachment to the Senate in 1998, 1999, when there was the Monica Lewinsky scandal with President Clinton. Basically, what they did is they impeach in the House, and then they appoint these managers to kind of prosecute the case before the Senate, and he was one there. He took over for Strom Thurmond, who was the longtime 100-plus age senator in 2003. Strom Thurmond retired from the Senate. And so you basically had only two people in that Senate seat since the mid-1950s. Strom Thurmond had served in that seat for decades. He retired at age 100, and Lindsey Graham took over in early 2003. The other thing that's always struck me about Lindsey Graham is that he was at the center of every single policy debate, whether it be Iran. I remember talking to him the night before the airstrike started, because there was some question about whether or not in late February they were going to continue or not. I remember a lengthy conversation I had with him in 2005. This is early 2005, when President George W. Bush was trying to partially privatize Social Security. And who was at the forefront of that? It was Lindsey Graham. I talked to a former aide of his just a few moments ago who described him as having an alligator skin, and said, you know, he didn't take the criticism that was sometimes lobbed at him personally, but said that he always, you know, could kind of disarm people. They said he probably could have been a stand-up comedian. People just didn't realize how funny he was, you know, when the camera lights turned off or he was trying to talk to some people off to the side. Now, here's what has to happen. As we say, we look at what the Senate situation is right now. We don't know the health condition of Mitch McConnell, the former Senate Majority Leader, who's been in the hospital for weeks. The Senate is supposed to come back in the coming days here, and so obviously they have to figure out, you know, what his status is. But right now, the Senate on the Republican side of the aisle is down to 51 votes. They have trouble moving things through the Senate right now, and so what will they do to replace him? Under South Carolina law, we're told that, and this is the process here, that they would probably have to have an appointment. Now, whether or not that's a caretaker senator, somebody who doesn't run. Again, Lindsey Graham was on the ballot this fall. He was running in the fall of 2026. He had just secured the Republican nomination for another term. So they would have to appoint somebody to the Senate. I would imagine that's going to be a conversation between Henry McMaster and also President Trump, you know, who he wants in the Senate. Do they want just a caretaker senator? We have one caretaker senator right now, Alan Armstrong, the Republican from Oklahoma, who took over for Markwayne Mullin, who is now the Homeland Security Secretary, of course. And does that person, do they want that person to be a caretaker, or do they want that person to run in a primary? I'm told that probably in about 5 to 6 weeks they would have to have another Republican primary to determine who their nominee is. And then that person, if they win in the fall, would take over on January 3rd. Here are the people I would look at in South Carolina. I would look at Russell Fry, the Republican representative from South Carolina. I would also look at two members. It's not a big delegation in South Carolina, but I would look at two of the other members who ran for governor, Nancy Mace and also Ralph Norman. Now, both of them have had a little bit of a fraught relationship with President Trump. Now, whether or not that's something that they can work out, we just don't know. But operationally in the Senate, this causes problems because Lindsey Graham was the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. You've been hearing a lot of conversation about them trying to do Budget Reconciliation 3.0. This is another policy bill. The Senate is looking a little more askance at this compared to the House of Representatives, but they'd have to have another Budget Committee chairman. He's been a member of the Judiciary Committee for a long time. They have a confirmation hearing coming up for Todd Blanche, the acting Attorney General, to become the Attorney General, and whether or not they could even get Todd Blanche's nomination out of committee, certainly not with those votes. They probably wouldn't have that vote this week at all, regardless of what happens in the confirmation hearing. But it makes it very, very tough operationally to do things in the Senate. And that's why we would probably look very quickly for them to figure out, OK, who do we appoint to the Senate, even if that's somebody on a temporary basis, and then who wants to run in that special election primary on the Republican side, probably sometime in late August, maybe 1st of September at the latest. But it's going to be very, very fast. The other thing I would say about Lindsey Graham, and again, you know, I talk about just how he was always at the center of so many issues. I remember kind of chasing him around the Capitol for a while. I was working on a story that we aired on Brett Baer's program some months back about Section 230. That's part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that he and others think that we should get rid of because it gives this shield to the telecom companies. And some people believe that's what's contributed to a lot of the social media ills that we have. And he wants to get rid of that. And again, just the fact, the reason we were having trouble scheduling the interview for so long was because he was so deep in Iran. He was so deep in dealing with Ukraine and 2 or 3 other subjects that he just didn't have the bandwidth, even though he was very interested in that. I remember I called him one night and he said, yes, I want to do it, but they were just we were literally having trouble figuring out when to schedule that interview. We did it. We aired the story, but it just shows you the breadth of different things that he was involved in. So Lindsey Graham, very sad news here in Washington, dead unexpectedly at the age of 71 years old here in Washington, D.C. Guys,
you did such a nice job walking through the history of all this. And I remember when Strom Thurmond retired, everyone thought there was no way anyone would be able to fill those shoes. And of course, Lindsey Graham did that and did it quite ably. And as you point out, covering a lot of a broad cross-section of issues. You noted also that a lot of people thought that he could have had a go at being a stand-up comedian because he could be very, very funny and very, very disarming. He was obviously fought for a very conservative state and a lot of conservative issues, but he was so effective at working across the aisle that that he could get a lot of things done. And I look back, remember probably every single Republican nominee to the Supreme Court and lower courts that got through because of Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, let me talk about the transformation of Lindsey Graham a little bit. He was going to run for president. He had a short-lived presidential campaign in 2015. He dropped out that fall. He was opposed to President Trump, said some pretty inflammatory things about why he didn't think that President Trump was fit to be in office. Kind of then started to side with President Trump. After the riot at the Capitol, said some pretty negative things about the president then, said count me out at some point, but then got back in President Trump's good graces and was a big advocate for him on Capitol Hill. And I want to go back to the 2018 confirmation fight about Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. That nomination they thought was going to be very dead in the water with Christine Blasey Ford after she brought forth some of her allegations about Justice Kavanaugh. And the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee were going to handle this in a very kid-gloves way. They brought in somebody else to kind of ask questions of her, a female attorney to kind of do their bidding, because they thought the optic of male senators asking these very probing questions about something that happened when they were back in high school was just going to be a bad optic. And at some point, this kind of spun off the rails. And it was Lindsey Graham who absolutely just shot up from his chair and was really, speaking at the top of his lungs, and it really changed the tenor of the hearing. And I think what happened there is it helped him kind of, get back in the graces of President Trump, understand that he was somebody fighting for the cause, fighting for the justice. He thought that, then nominee Kavanaugh was being ill-treated. And it was probably one of the most electrifying moments in that hearing. I want to go back to 2013 when they were trying to work out with the Gang of 14 the immigration reform bill. This was something that he and John McCain and others had worked on. They got, almost 2/3 of a vote in the Senate. It never went anywhere in the House. But I was told that because Lindsey Graham was such a good poker player, he kind of had to, fake that they had the votes. Now, they had more than 2/3 on that vote. It was a pretty overwhelming vote. But the idea, again, that he was just at the center of everything and the guy that he would come to. Covering the Senate for as long as I have, there's people who become the majority leader, the minority leader, the whip, et cetera. Those are never positions that Lindsey Graham had. But there historically have been people in the Senate who always kind of made things work behind the scenes. Sometimes they were very prominent. You saw them on the air a lot. You saw them in Senate debate a lot. But I think of somebody like Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. I think of somebody like Richard Russell, who the Russell Senate Office Building is named after. They completely knew how the Senate operated and knew where all the votes were on every single issue on both sides. And that was Lindsey Graham. And that's why this is just not the death of a senator. This is why foreign leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu and others are sending in their tributes, because he was such a force.
Well, sure. And to your point, we can remember back when it was Lindsey Graham who was part of the Three Amigos, right? It was Senator John McCain, Senator Joe Lieberman, and Lindsey Graham. And you saw this sort of group that could work across the aisles. But I want to go back just for a second, because I think when we look back on, and you're right, Chad, you're so right that he was at the center of every policy debate. I think one of the defining moments in his political career was the Kavanaugh hearing, because because, as you rightfully point out, the Kavanaugh nomination looked all but dead in the water. And out of nowhere, during Kavanaugh's Judiciary Committee hearing, he all of a sudden just lit up the entire committee and his entire Senate colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, calling what was being done to him the most despicable sham he had ever seen in his political life, and pointed to everyone on that committee, including the Republicans, and said, if you vote against this man, this is a travesty. And it totally changed the trajectory. I would say it got Kavanaugh across the aisle, but it also demonstrated not only could he put himself at the center of policy debates, but he could wield political capital in ways that some senators and leaders just don't quite learn. Speak to that if you can.
Yeah, he understood what capital that he had, and he understood, at certain points, when to use anger. That was an example during the Brett Kavanaugh hearing. I've seen him do that before in other debates, but also, as I said, be disarming with humor. That's what makes somebody like Senator Graham, be they a Democrat or a Republican, very effective. Somebody who can kind of do that and understand, where those different power sources are coming from. And if you make a miscalculation on that, and I didn't see Lindsey Graham make very many political miscalculations, that's significant. He thought at that moment, for obvious reasons, that maybe they could salvage the nomination, and the only way to salvage it was through what he did. Because, again, this was the second confirmation hearing for Kavanaugh. Remember, we had gone through this. The allegations from Christine Blasey Ford came much later. And, again, even in dealing with his relationship with President Trump, there was a point where, he was very outspoken, coming into 2016 against President Trump, thought that he was not fit for office. I remember a very frank conversation with myself and some other reporters in the Senate subway station where he really tore into, Donald Trump, who I don't even think at that point in 2016 was the nominee yet, and just did not think that this guy was fit. But again, he always understood where that political power was ebbing and flowing. Obviously, President Trump was elected in 2016, and he moved to that and figured out, okay, if we're going to get things done, okay, that's where we need to be. Some people might, criticize that of being a chameleon, but honestly, in the years that I've been around Capitol Hill, those who get things done on both sides of the aisle are those who understand where those power centers ebb and flow, and then figure out a way to move toward that. And then, sometimes you're trying to get something for your state. Sometimes you're trying to get something for your party. Sometimes you're trying to get something for yourself. You need the president's support or the support of the leader or somebody for your election. Lindsey Graham was always somebody who was able to kind of morph in that sense, and that worked to his benefit.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this relationship between President Trump and Lindsey Graham. You're right. He was a huge critic. I remember being in a room with him once where he was not just making fun of President Trump, but his voters. And he clearly did not like him in 2016. But your Kavanaugh moment was a bonding moment on both sides. I think President Trump saw that Lindsey Graham could get things done. And then Lindsey Graham realized, I think, as you rightly point out, that, this was going to be the next president, or this was going to be the president. This is where the power is. I need to go to him. He was clearly much more hawkish and much more prone towards what some would say neoconism than President Trump, who originally started as, no more new wars. And so I think that relationship, I think Lindsey brought President Trump over to his side on sometimes, and I think President Trump brought him over. I also will say that the game of golf can be very bonding. Both of them loved the game. They played often at Bedminster and some of his other clubs, the president's other clubs. So I think this was also a bonding moment. Chad, the last time I saw Lindsey Graham was at the state dinner with King Charles, and he sat right across from me. He looked fine to me. You've seen him in person more recently. I know it appears, at least from the reports we've seen, that it might have been a cardiac arrest. His father died of a cardiac arrest. But the reports also say something about a brief illness. Do you have any more information about that?
You know, we just don't know at this stage. I remember, you know, when I went to interview him, and again, this was some months ago. It was in the late winter or early spring, and this was a separate one-off interview, just not grabbing him in the hallway as we often did about the Section 230 story. But I remember he had a pretty bad cold then, and I will say this: you know, I didn't know, I hadn't heard anything about any health issues surrounding him or anything like that. I will say that because he was always globetrotting, you know, be it the Middle East or Europe or someplace else. I did notice in the past few months he did look a little more tired and a little more haggard. You know, as I said, he had just turned 71 a couple of days ago. I don't know if that's age or something else, but it was just something, as somebody who covers the Hill on a day-to-day basis, you notice things about people, especially people who've been there for an awfully long time. And I noticed that he did look, I would say in the past year or so, it was just a visual recognition. He didn't seem to be to look as maybe as physically strong as he was. That's just my observation. You know, I want to be very clear. I don't know if there's anything that was going on. I do know he was sick and suffering from a pretty bad cold that lingered for a while when I had him, and I think that was one of the reasons we couldn't get the interview at some point, because he had been sick and his voice sounded bad and all that. So I don't want to read too much into that. But you know, that's this is always the thing about covering things in Washington. I said this on the air in the middle of the night here when we broke into coverage this morning. I said there's an old Native American phrase that death comes and it's always out of season. Mm-hmm. Here, everybody in Washington is focused on Mitch McConnell and is he going to be able to come back? They've not been very forthcoming about that. Just a couple of weeks ago, everybody was saying, what about Tom Kean Jr., the Republican representative from New Jersey? What is his situation? We just don't know. And then somebody you're not even focusing on, just passes away suddenly. And it's just remarkable. And I think that's part of the shock in this, that this was not something that was expected by anyone here on Capitol Hill.
Truly. Chad Pergram, thank you so much for your long history and wisdom on all of this.
Thanks, Chad.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.